Welcome back to WRHU's special broadcast, taking a look back at the one-year anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Joe Viglucci, joined by my co-anchor, Kate O'Brien. To break down how women in the workforce were disproportionately affected by the pandemic, we're joined by University of Florida business professor, Dr. Amanda Phelan. Dr. Phelan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. All right, so what was the status of the gender disparity between men and women before the beginning of COVID-19?
So pre-COVID, the wage gap was about 18 cents, meaning that for every dollar a man earns, a woman earns 82 cents. Now, according to research, we can explain away about 60% of that gap by taking into account the choices that women make. So on average, for instance, women choose lower paying jobs. They have fewer years of experience because they take time off to raise a family, and more often women are going to choose part-time work with more flexibility. The rest of that gap, 40% of it, we can't explain away, and evidence shows that bias is definitely a factor. But thinking about the pre-COVID world, I want to examine a little more closely that part of the wage gap that we can explain, because when we do, it becomes clear that even there, gender bias plays a big role, and that bias has really been exacerbated during the pandemic. So pre-COVID, we know that women spend twice as much time on family caretaking than do men. So even without the pandemic, women were more likely to leave the workforce to care for their family. They were more likely to work fewer hours and to work in lower paying jobs if and when they decided to return. And on top of that, data have shown that from the beginning, women, even as young girls, are discouraged from focusing on math and science, these STEM fields where salaries are higher. So yes, while in the pre-COVID world, the majority of the gender wage gap can be explained away by women's individual choices, those decisions are not made in an unbiased vacuum. Women's decisions are shaped by the world that we live in. There are some inequalities there that we were already dealing with before the pandemic.
And you gave us great context to the background of this gender disparity. How has COVID-19 exacerbated it?
Right. Well, women have been dropping out of the labor force much more quickly than men. A report from the Center for American Progress found that mothers with young kids in particular have reduced their working hours 4 to 5 times more than fathers. And, this is not just about the wages that they lose while they're working at home, because any time away from the labor force reduces earnings presently and down the road. The center also found that a woman in her 20s who takes off 5 years from work can reduce her lifetime earnings by about 20%. And that's because this includes not only the loss in immediate income, but loss in wage growth and lost retirement earnings. So anytime a woman spends time out of the workforce or reducing her work, as is happening right now, her bank account is going to get hit twice. First, the loss in immediate earnings, and second, the long-term compounding reductions over time. And on top of all that, the research shows really clearly that the longer that someone is out of work, the harder it is for them to find a job again. So women have really been set back.
Can you talked a lot about the women, but can you kind of go in depth with the men?
Well, this recession has been coined by some as a she-cession, and it's actually really impacted women's jobs much more than men's jobs. This is actually the complete opposite of what we saw during the Great Recession. During the Great Recession, the industries that were hit were sectors like construction, and we saw a lot of job losses among men, and it was more muted among women. This time, we've seen a huge amount of job losses in, for example, the service sector, travel, etc., and that's where a lot of women work, healthcare also. So it really has impacted women, and particularly low-income women who happen to be more often women of color than it has men.
So you mentioned before how because of this pandemic, women were forced to take less hours at their jobs. So based on what you've seen, have women actually applied for unemployment or filed for more jobless claims during this pandemic?
Well, I think everybody has. If we look at the overall data, the files for unemployment claims, they've certainly come down from the height last spring that we saw, but they still remain well elevated above what they were before the pandemic. And I think we're seeing both men and women who are unemployed take advantage of that. But because the unemployment is hitting women more, I would expect to see more women taking home those unemployment checks.
And now we're slowly reaching what hopefully will be the end of this pandemic. Do you foresee an ending to this problem in the near future, given all of the economic uncertainty right now?
It's hard to say because what's happened during this time is going to have a very large economic impact. Between the lost wages, the lost wage growth, the lost investments, and lost economic activity from women who are out of the market, I think we're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars in losses to the overall economy on the low end in the short term. In the long term, to have a generation of women set back in this way is going to lower our country's overall growth trajectory. Because when we don't have an economy where all people are able to thrive, where all people are able to engage economically, what that means is that we're leaving human talents and resources and abilities untapped. So if we don't find a way to improve, we're leaving enormous amounts of economic potential on the table and just letting it go to waste. So that's the big issue, the big question that we'll have to deal with because even though this is and has been called a she session, the fact that so many women have been impacted is really going to harm overall economic growth and health.
How do we draw women back into the workforce and allow them to thrive, as you mentioned?
That is an excellent question. It is a really tough question, and I think there are a couple of huge changes that have to take place. First of all, policy initiatives that are going to make childcare more easily available and more affordable. Data show that in many parts across the country, when there is access to childcare, it's as expensive or more expensive than sending a child to college to have your child in daycare. There are also a lot of what are called daycare deserts or childcare deserts. There are lots of regions around the country that are unfortunately found in lower income areas and sometimes rural areas where there just isn't a lot of daycare available. And when we don't have family care and caretaking valued and really made accessible to large swaths of the population, that's really going to hamper women's involvement. Now, along with that, I think we also need a fundamental shift in how not only our society values caretaking, but also along with that, how we view and judge our traditional gender roles. For a long time, women have been advocating for more family-friendly policies. But I would say men need to start doing that as well because they're parents too. And these policies benefit the entire family and the entire economy. It's not just about women.
Dr. Phelan, you gave us tons of important information on this issue tonight. Do you have anything else that you would like to add?
Yeah, one thing that I did want to point out is that as bad as things have been for women compared to men, even among women, there are certain groups that have really been disproportionately impacted. Namely, these are lower income workers who are more likely to be women of color. These are people who have to work in person, who can't survive on one person's income, and job losses have fallen disproportionately on this group of women. And there's actually a really sad irony here. It turns out that since the onset of COVID, that 18-cent gender wage gap that I mentioned at the beginning of our interview has actually dropped slightly to 17.7 cents, which sounds great. We're closing the wage gap, even though there's a pandemic. But actually, it's not great. The average age or the average wage for women has gone up over the last year, but only because so many low-income women have lost their jobs. That means that their previously earned low wages are no longer included in that statistic. So not only is it women that are being hit hard, but it's low income and women of color who are really bearing the brunt of the COVID economy.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Phelan.
It was great to be here. Thanks for having me.